He thought he found treasure hidden under his bathtub, but when he opened the chest, what he discovered inside was far more dangerous than gold. A single diary had the power to expose secrets that powerful families wanted buried forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. When Alex first stepped across the threshold of the house, the air itself seemed older than him, as though each breath he took contained the dust of decades. The wooden floorboards groaned under his boots, and the faint smell of mildew clung stubbornly to the walls. It was not a place that felt like home, not to him. Not yet. This house had belonged to his grandfather, a man of firm words and reserved affections who had passed only a few months earlier. Alex had not expected to inherit the property, but he had accepted it as a practical matter, telling himself he would fix it up just enough to sell and then walk away from it forever. The house resisted him from the beginning. It stood with a weary dignity, its paint long since faded, its windows blurred by years of dust. On the outside, the roof sagged at the corners, and the gutters clung desperately by rusted nails. Inside, the walls bore cracks like old scars, and the pipes rattled whenever the water was turned on, echoing through the rooms as though the house itself sighed in protest. Still, despite the disrepair, there was a stubborn strength about it, a quiet suggestion that it had weathered worse than peeling paint or faulty plumbing. At first, Alex treated the house with the detachment of a worker facing a job. He carried in cleaning supplies, stacked them on the counter of the outdated kitchen, and opened every window to let in the early spring air. Dust motes drifted lazily in the sunlight, swirling in patterns that made him pause for a moment. He remembered, faintly, sitting at this very kitchen table as a child, while his grandfather brewed strong black coffee. But the memory slipped away quickly, buried under the weight of time. He told himself sentiment would only make this harder, and he could not afford to grow attached. Days passed with the monotony of chores. He scrubbed walls, pulled up old rugs, and dragged broken furniture out to the curb. The house yielded its secrets slowly. In the living room, he found a box of yellowed newspapers, stacked neatly as if his grandfather had meant to preserve a record of something important. The dates stretched back to the 1940s, stories of war and scarcity, but also of victories and rebuilding. In the attic, tucked between moth-eaten blankets, he uncovered photographs, his grandfather standing stiffly beside men Alex did not recognize. Some wore military uniforms, their faces shadowed and stern, while others looked like townsfolk, captured awkwardly on camera. None of the names were written on the back, except for a few faint notes in pencil, initials, and dates that meant little to him. Though he did not admit it out loud, Alex began to feel that the house was more than just an old building. There was a weight in the air that clung to him as he worked. At night, when he turned off the lights, the silence was thick, filled with the kind of stillness that seemed to wait for something. Sometimes he thought he heard faint creaks upstairs, or the rustle of paper, but he told himself it was only the house settling. And yet, a strange unease grew inside him, like a whisper that somewhere behind the walls or under the floors, something waited to be found. It was on a particularly long day, when he finally turned his attention to the bathroom, that the first real crack in the ordinary appeared. The bathroom was perhaps the most outdated room of all, its tiles faded and chipped, the bathtub rim stained with decades of water. He planned only to reseal the pipes and perhaps replace the sink, nothing more. He knelt by the tub, tapping along the base to check for leaks, when a curious sound caught his ear. One of the tiles gave a hollow ring, unlike the others. He tapped again, slower this time. The sound echoed faintly, as though beneath the floor there was empty space. Curiosity prickled through him. He told himself it was probably nothing, maybe a gap left by poor repairs. Yet the more he tapped, the more certain he became. Something was concealed beneath. He fetched a small hammer and struck carefully at the grout. The tile broke free with surprising ease, and he leaned closer, squinting at the dark gap that appeared beneath. It was not just an empty space. There was wood under the tile, aged and splintering, cut with deliberate edges. His pulse quickened as he scraped away more of the flooring until the shape of a hidden panel revealed itself. It was a trapdoor, though small and cleverly concealed. Cement and tiles had been laid over it, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it would never be discovered. For a moment, Alex simply sat back on his heels, staring at the panel. His heart pounded. He thought of stories of hidden treasures, of forgotten safes, and buried heirlooms. He shook his head, telling himself it was ridiculous, but his hands moved with a will of their own as he pried at the edges with a crowbar. With a groan, the wood gave way, and the trapdoor swung open. Beneath it, shrouded in shadows, was a chest. It was larger than he expected, iron-bound and heavy, the surface dulled with rust. Dust clung to it in thick layers, as though it had slept there untouched for generations. The sight of it struck him silent. He reached down, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and felt a surge of disbelief. Carefully, with all the strength he could summon, he lifted it out of the hollow and onto the cracked tiles. The weight of it almost toppled him, but he managed to drag it into the center of the room. For a long while, he simply stared at it. The chest looked like something from another world, a relic of seafaring tales or whispered family legends. The lock was still intact, though corroded, and he fetched his tools with trembling hands. It took him nearly an hour to break it, the metal shrieking as the lock finally snapped. The lid creaked open, the hinges stiff with age, and a breath of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of dust and forgotten years. What he saw inside made his heart stumble. There were coins, old and golden, catching the faint light with a muted glow. Silver trinkets nestled beside them, tarnished but unmistakably valuable. A pocket watch gleamed faintly, its face cracked but elegant. Yet his eyes were drawn not to the wealth, but to the bundle of papers laid neatly at the bottom. Bound with a strip of faded ribbon, they bore the marks of time creases, yellowed edges, smudges of ink. A thick notebook lay beneath them, its leather cover worn thin. Alex sat on the cold bathroom floor, staring down into the chest. He should have felt triumphant, overjoyed, but instead, a heavy stillness filled him. The treasure was real, yes, but the papers seemed to radiate a different kind of weight. They were not simply keepsakes. They looked like they were meant to be read, meant to survive. He lifted them with careful hands, brushing the dust away, and felt a shiver run through him. The house had given him something, not by chance, but by design. His grandfather had lived here his whole life, and now Alex wondered if this secret had been waiting, deliberately buried beneath the most ordinary place of all, a bathtub, hidden where no one would ever think to look. He closed the chest, his mind already racing with questions. The coins, the trinkets, they were valuable, yes, but the letters and notebook carried something else. They carried truth, and truth, he suspected, would not be as easily controlled as gold. Night had fallen by the time he left the bathroom. The house was silent again, but now its silence felt different, not empty, but watchful. As he carried the bundle of papers into the living room, setting them gently on the table, he felt a strange connection to the walls around him. Perhaps his grandfather had meant for him to find this, to continue a story left unfinished. And though he told himself he would rest and begin reading tomorrow, Alex knew he would not sleep easily that night. The house was no longer just an inheritance. It was a vault, and now its secrets belonged to him. The night after Alex found the chest, he lay in the unfamiliar bed of his grandfather's house, his thoughts circling endlessly. He had closed the lid, locked the door to the bathroom, and tried to convince himself he could wait until morning before examining the contents. Yet every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, pulled him back to the memory of the yellowed papers tied with a ribbon. Sleep never came. When dawn finally broke, pale and thin across the curtains, he rose without hesitation and went straight to the living room where he had left the bundle on the table. The coins and trinkets he had pushed aside, almost as if they were distractions. It was the words, the ink on fragile pages, that drew him with a force he could not ignore. He untied the ribbon slowly, as though breaking some ancient seal, and spread the first letter flat before him. The handwriting was precise, steady. Each word pressed deeply into the paper. The date at the top startled him. 1943. His eyes followed the lines, piecing together a voice from the past. At first it was difficult, the language formal, the phrasing heavy with caution. But as he read on, the shape of a story began to emerge. His great-grandfather had written these words, a man Alex had only ever heard mentioned in fragments, a figure who had disappeared under vague circumstances during wartime. The letters spoke of fear and suspicion, of trusted friends who had turned into enemies when survival demanded betrayal. There was mention of hidden valuables, not only to protect wealth, but to ensure that something of their family's legacy would endure if they were stripped of everything else. One page described men arriving late at night, demanding cooperation, demanding loyalty to a cause Alex's great-grandfather would not support. Another page hinted at escape routes, at tunnels beneath the city, at coded messages exchanged in whispered meetings. Alex felt his chest tighten as he realized these were not just idle recollections. They were confessions. Testimonies meant for no one's eyes but those of blood. There were names listed in careful handwriting, names of people whose descendants still held power in the town. He recognized them from headlines, from campaign posters, from the plaques on city buildings. These were families who had built reputations of philanthropy and leadership, yet here, in his hands, was the suggestion that their wealth and status had been cemented in treachery. He turned page after page, the silence of the house broken only by the rustle of fragile paper. The notebook revealed even more. His great-grandfather described how he had gathered not just coins, but documents, deeds, and agreements that proved how land had been stolen, how properties had changed hands under the pressure of threats. The words grew darker as the entries went on. He wrote of hiding, of always watching the door, of expecting betrayal even from those closest to him. And then, toward the end, there was resignation. A passage where he admitted he might not live long enough to clear his name, where he confessed his only hope was that someday, someone in the family would uncover what he had left behind and decide what to do with it. Alex's hands trembled as he closed the notebook. It was as if his great-grandfather had spoken directly to him, across decades, binding him into a story he had never asked to inherit. He looked again at the chest, at the gleam of coins dulled by time, at the cracked watch face and the tarnished silver. They were worth money, yes, but the papers were something else entirely. They were dangerous. The days that followed blurred together, each one consumed by reading and rereading. He pieced together timelines, cross-referenced names with the faint memories of local history he had grown up with. His grandfather had never spoken of this, never hinted that the house under its shabby paint held such a secret. And yet, the older man had lived here until his death, quietly, sternly, as if guarding something invisible. Alex began to believe that his discovery had not been chance at all. Perhaps his grandfather had wanted him to find it, had left the bathroom untouched all these years, precisely so the chest would remain hidden until the right time. But with knowledge came unease. One evening, as he stepped outside to fetch groceries, he noticed a car parked across the street. A man sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed not on the road, but on the house. Alex slowed, trying to convince himself it was a coincidence. But when he returned an hour later, the car was still there. The man was gone, yet the sense of being watched lingered. Another night, the phone rang. He answered, expecting a wrong number, but silence met him. Only the faint sound of breathing, then the line went dead. He told himself it was nothing, but when it happened again the next evening, a chill crept down his spine. The house, which had once felt merely old, now felt observed, as though shadows pressed closer to the windows. The more he thought of it, the more he realized how vulnerable he was. These documents, if genuine, could ruin powerful people. They could strip away the facades of families who had controlled business and politics in the town for generations. If anyone knew he had them, or even suspected, he would be in danger. The treasure he had unearthed was not a gift, but a burden, a test. He sat long into the night, staring at the papers spread across the table. What was he supposed to do with them? He could lock them away, forget he had ever found them, and use the gold to pay his debts. He could walk away from this crumbling house, sell it to the highest bidder, and build a new life far from here. Or he could act. He could expose what his great-grandfather had tried to preserve, throw light on what had been kept in shadow for nearly a century. But to do that meant risking everything: his safety, his peace, perhaps even his life. Memories of his grandfather came unbidden, stern lectures about honesty, quiet warnings about cutting corners in life. The old man had always seemed unyielding, sometimes cold, but now Alex wondered if that severity had been born of knowledge, of carrying secrets that weighed too heavily to share. Perhaps the silence had been protection, both for himself and for the family. The wind rattled the window panes as Alex sat there, unable to move. The pages lay before him, fragile yet unbreakable in their truth. His great-grandfather's words seemed to whisper across the years. "This is what I leave you. This is the truth. This is your choice." He understood now that he was no longer simply a man fixing up an old house. He was the heir to a legacy, written not in money, but in secrets. A legacy that demanded decision. As dawn touched the sky again, he gathered the letters into a neat stack and pressed the notebook on top. He could not yet bring himself to decide, but the path was narrowing. The world outside already seemed aware that something had shifted. And deep down, though fear tugged at him, he knew that the silence could not hold forever. His great-grandfather had trusted the future to him, and the question was no longer if he would act, but when. Morning arrived heavy and gray, the kind of morning that blurred into the night before it, when Alex finally pushed the last of his grandfather's papers aside and pressed his palms against his weary eyes. The hours he had spent poring over the diaries had hollowed him out, filled him with both purpose and dread. It was no longer a matter of curiosity, no longer the thrill of uncovering a secret beneath the bathroom floor. Now the discovery had grown into something sharp-edged, a truth that pressed against him with the weight of expectation. He had not asked for this responsibility, yet here it was, waiting at the table each morning, whispering at him from every corner of the house. He could not move through the rooms without feeling the gaze of those who had come before him, those who had trusted him, though he had never known it until now. The tension outside the house mirrored the unease within it. The car returned, though sometimes it was a different one, parked in another shadow, sometimes a block away, sometimes directly across the street, as though daring him to confront it. Twice he thought he saw the same man from before, standing too still at the corner near the lamppost, his hands buried in his pockets, his eyes turned toward the house. Alex did not approach him, though he thought about it. Something in the man's stillness kept him away, a silent warning that it was safer not to ask questions aloud. Inside the house, the telephone calls grew bolder. The first ones had been silent, but now voices spoke, flat and measured, warning him to stop searching, telling him to forget what he had found. The words were vague, but their menace was not. At night, sharp knocks rattled the door, and when he opened it, no one stood there. On another evening, he found a folded piece of paper under the doormat. It contained only a few words written in blocky handwriting. Sell the house, take the money, and leave. The weight of fear pressed on him, and yet, alongside it, a new determination began to grow. Each threat seemed to confirm that what he had in his possession mattered more than even he had realized. If the papers were worthless, no one would bother with warnings. If they were simply the ramblings of a man long dead, no one would sit in cars outside or leave notes in the night. The very danger that circled him was proof that the truth in those pages still had the power to wound, even after all these years. That realization changed the way he looked at everything. He thought often of his grandfather, the man who had lived in this house with such stern silence. How many nights had the old man sat at this very table, his eyes on the same walls, his heart carrying the same burden. The chest had not been hidden by chance. It had been buried deliberately, disguised beneath tiles and cement, placed under the most ordinary of rooms so that no intruder would ever think to seek it there. The house had been a vault, and his grandfather its guardian, even if Alex had never known it. Now that duty had passed to him, whether he wanted it or not. The choice loomed before him. He could gather the coins and trinkets, sell them discreetly, and vanish into a life of ease, free from debt and worry. No one would blame him for it. No one, except perhaps the man who had written those words in ink 70 years ago, and the man who had died leaving this house behind, as if to remind him of what mattered. Or he could stand against the shadows pressing closer, lift the truth into daylight, and let it cut where it must, no matter the cost. The days turned restless. He moved through the house with the letters always near, the notebook resting in plain sight, as though he wanted to remind himself it was real. Meals lost their flavor, sleep refused to come, and every sound outside sharpened his nerves. Yet through the fear, the decision hardened within him, slowly at first, then suddenly with a clarity that startled him. He would not run. He would not bury what had already been unearthed. If his great-grandfather had believed these records worth protecting, then Alex would honor that belief. The next steps came in a blur of motion, driven by urgency before fear could overtake him again. He made copies of the most incriminating documents, careful scans and photographs, ensuring that if anything happened to him, the truth would not be lost. He placed the originals in a secure box and carried them to a trusted friend, one of the few people he believed would not betray him. The rest he delivered to a local historian he had known from his school years, a man who had dedicated his life to the preservation of the town's past. The historian's eyes widened as he read, his lips moving silently over the names and dates. But he asked no questions. He only promised to protect the records until they could be shared publicly. Not long after, he arranged a meeting with a journalist from the city, someone known for refusing to bend under pressure. He carried the copies to her in a plain envelope, explaining only that they came from family archives, that the truth had been hidden too long. Her silence as she read was its own kind of confirmation. When she looked up, her eyes burned with the fire of a story that would not be ignored. The threats continued even as he prepared to expose everything. The knocks at the door grew louder, the calls harsher. One evening, a window shattered, the cold night air rushing in with the sound of retreating footsteps. Alex repaired it in silence, the glass crunching beneath his boots as he swept. And in that moment, he felt something shift within him. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled him. The house had tested him, the chest had tried him, and he had chosen not to fail. The article appeared weeks later, the town shaking beneath its revelations. Names once spoken with reverence now dripped with suspicion, their histories unmasked as stained with betrayal. Families who had walked with pride through city halls now lowered their eyes, their reputations unraveling beneath the weight of documented truth. The storm was fierce, but it was cleansing. For Alex, it was not triumph he felt, but release, as though he had finally exhaled a breath held by his family for generations. The coins and trinkets he donated to the local museum, displayed under glass with a plaque that bore his great-grandfather's name. The pocket watch he kept, not for its value, but as a reminder of the man who had chosen to preserve the truth in ink and courage. With part of the remaining treasure, he paid his debts, secured his future, and gave quietly to families in the town who struggled as his had once struggled. The rest remained locked away, not as wealth, but as history, preserved for those who would come after him. The house itself he did not sell. Though it had begun as a burden, it had become something else entirely. He restored it slowly, repairing walls, replacing the roof, breathing life back into its bones. In the living room, he created a space dedicated to the story he had uncovered, not for the public, but for family. There, the notebooks rested, the photographs lined the shelves, and the silence of the rooms felt no longer heavy, but protective. It was no longer just a house, it was a keeper of memory, a place where truth had been hidden and finally revealed. When Alex sat alone at the table at night, the air no longer pressed against him with unease. Instead, it felt watchful in a different way, like an old guardian standing at ease now that its duty had passed on. He realized then that the treasure under the bathroom had never been meant to enrich him with gold. It had been meant to test him, to see if he would value truth over comfort, honor over ease. And in the quiet of the house, with the weight of the years resting not as a burden, but as a legacy, he knew he had passed. The treasure had been a trial, and it had changed him forever. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.